Hi, welcome to Hillcrest Sermons, growing together.
Show us your heart's delight.
Welcome to Hillcrest. I'm Tim. Glad to be with you this morning. I want to invite you to open up in your Bibles to Mark chapter 5 is where we're going to begin this morning. Mark is one of the four ancient biographies of Jesus. It's way to the right. It's after Matthew and before Luke. That's where we're going to be starting. And we're actually going to be jumping around in the Gospels a little bit, so you can, just be ready for that. We are continuing our Alone Together series today. And where we've been so far, we've had 3 weeks so far. So the first week we talked about creation, and we just wanted to kind of set this groundwork that we are made in the image of a relational God, a triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, and therefore that being made in the image of God means we are made for relationship. And that like every single person you ever encounter is a person who is made in the image of this relational God, and a person who, in their soul, they long for relationship. This is what it means to be human. We talked about creation. We talked about sin in the second week, and the idea that sin, one of the things that sin does, this distrust of God, that it results in the distortion and the destruction of human community. That there's something wrong in this world, and that sin, it destroys, even disappears human community. And we talked about kind of the cultural moment and the modern West, North America that we live in. It's just a place that like community is disappearing in many ways. I've just kind of been, whenever you're in a topic, you're researching, I've just been seeing over and over again how community is disappearing. A couple of the stats that I saw this past week. This is surveys they've been taken of 12th and 8th graders since 1975. I guess they started a little later with 8th graders. This is the number of times 12th and 8th graders got together with friends in a given week. And over the last, 45 years or so, it has just gone down. Yeah, it's fascinating. Just social connections outside of school, outside of sports, connections with friends going down. It's interesting. Right around here is where smartphones became very ubiquitous. And that's kids. Also, the same thing is for adults. I've mentioned before this. The U.S. Surgeon General report on the epidemic of loneliness. This is some of the research out of there. But this is time that U.S. adults spend with others in a given day or a given month. And so this is pretty small. So I'll just point some of these out. This is from 2003 to 2021 or something. We on average spend 24 hours per month more alone. So in a given month, 24 hours more by ourselves. In a given month, 5 hours less per month with family we live with. This one is 6.5 hours less per month in family that we don't live with. This companionship is like hobbies, so 14 hours less per month, hobbies, sports, that kind of thing. Then we've got social engagements with friends, 20 hours less per month since 2003. And then social engagement with others, non-friends, enemies, I'm not quite sure what that means there, but 10 hours less per month. But every single metric, there's just time usage. These are time usage surveys that they do in the U.S. Just every single metric is less time with other people. The sin results in the distortion of community, but also just the destruction, the disappearance of community. And this is one way that sin is working its way out in the cultural moment that we live in. So we talked about creation, we talked about sin, and then last week Hannah, thank you Hannah, talked about the mission of Jesus, and that Jesus is making a people. And that too often we understand Jesus' movement in purely individualistic terms, like me and my faith with Jesus, me and Jesus. But when you look at the New Testament, it's clear it's not just that. Jesus is making a community. He's making a people. You are adopted into the family of God. Whether you always experience that or not, this is what Jesus is up to. And so today I want to kind of take that the next step further and just talk about if Jesus is making a people, what does rich community look like? What are some of the dynamics around that? I guess I'd say it this way, that if being part of Jesus' people, if one of the things that Jesus is doing is trying to lead us into the way life is meant to be lived, it seems like followers of Jesus, we should be really good, savvy thinkers about how does community work? And what does that look like? And how do we foster that? And what should we expect to see? And I just want to talk about some of this. It's a little theoretical, some of the things I'm going to talk about today, and so some of us that'll be really interesting, some will be boring. I'm sorry, but I think followers of Jesus should be really savvy about community and belonging and relationship. These are terms that can be quite slippery. They can mean different things to different people, and so I just want to poke around. What are we looking for? What is the kind of community Jesus is making? What does that look like? What is belonging there? So. That's where we're headed. And now let's jump into the book of Mark and begin looking at what kind of connections we might be expecting to see. So we're going to begin in Mark chapter 5, verse 37. So Jesus, we're going to jump into the middle of several stories. But this one, we're jumping into the middle of a story. There's a father who has come to Jesus, said, my daughter is on death's doorstep. Will you come and heal her? And Jesus said, yes. And then we're told who Jesus brings along with him to go heal the daughter. Chapter 5, verse 37, we read, Jesus, did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. He's going to heal. He's going to heal this young woman, and he says, "Not all you disciples get to come. You three, Peter, James, and John, you come with me." Flip over to the right to Mark chapter 9. Just a couple pages to the right. We're kind of right here in the middle of the story of Jesus in Mark. Jesus has just announced that he's headed to Jerusalem. He's going to be betrayed and executed. It's this kind of turning point in his life. And the next thing he does, we read in chapter 9, verse 2. It says, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. Jesus comes to this turning point in his life, this turning point in the story, and he gets alone time with these three people, Peter, James, and John. Flip farther to the right in the book of Mark to chapter 14. This is the last night of Jesus' life. He's had the Last Supper. He's going to be betrayed and arrested soon. He goes out to this place called Gethsemane. His soul is in torment. He just wants to pray, and he just wants some support with him while he's praying. And in chapter 14, verse 33, we read, he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. Peter, James, and John. It seems when we go through the story of the life of Jesus, it seems that these three, Peter, James, and John, had some kind of intimacy, had some kind of connection with Jesus that other people didn't have. He had this inner three, this inner circle. Jesus wasn't best friends with everybody. They had this intentional cultivation of a certain kind of close relationship with Peter, James, and John. It's inner three. All right, hold that. Now, but of course, he didn't only have 3 disciples. He had more than 3 disciples. So jump back now. I told you we jump around a lot. Jump back down to Mark chapter 3. This is what Jan read earlier. So we had this inner 3 who he's quite close with. But in chapter 3, verse 13, of course, we get the famous 12 apostles or 12 disciples. In chapter 3, verse 13, we read, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach. And so this is the 12 disciples that we've all heard about, these 12 dear friends of Jesus, his apprentices who follow with him. What's the first thing when it says the first purpose of Jesus calling these 12? What's the first purpose that is listed of the calling of the 12? He appointed 12 that they might be with him. He calls these 12 apprentices, that they might relationally be present with Jesus. So Jesus had his inner three, he had his 12. And I think sometimes we think of the 12 and we think Jesus only had 12 disciples, but he had more than 12 disciples. We're in the book of Mark. Now we get to flip over to the book of Luke. Flip over to the right to the book of Luke. Luke chapter, I think it's 10. Yeah, Luke chapter 10. This is actually a theme. This came up when we were doing the Luke series. I don't know if you remember the Joanna sermon, but we touched on this idea a little bit. But Jesus had more than simply 12 disciples. And we read about these more than 12, than 12 disciples, more than 12 apprentices in Luke chapter 10, verse 1. We read this: after this, the Lord, that is Jesus, appointed 72 others and sent them 2 by 2 ahead of him to every town and place where he was about to go. And so not only did Jesus have the 12 disciples, 12 apprentices, but apparently there's this circle of at least 72 others who Jesus knew well enough, and they knew him well enough that they could act as his representatives in villages that Jesus was going to. So there's this larger circle of apprentices and disciples. But of course, the community around Jesus didn't stop there. We're in the book of Luke. Flip all the way back now to Luke chapter, where's this last one that we're going to? Let's see, 6 is where we're headed to. Luke chapter 6, verse 17. Because we know Jesus' movement wasn't just like 70 people who followed him around for 3 years, that there was a larger circle there. Luke chapter 6, verse 17, he went down with them and stood on a level place. A large crowd of his disciples was there, and a great number of people from all over Judea, from Jerusalem, and from the coastal region of Tyre and Sidon. And so we see that beyond the 72, there's just these crowds of people. At different points in the biographies of Jesus, we're told that it numbered well over 4,000, 5,000 people who considered themselves part of the Jesus movement and traveled around with Jesus. And so when we look at the kind of community, the kind of levels of relationship that Jesus found himself in, we see that they weren't all the same. There's this richness, this nuance about the relational life that Jesus found himself in. He had an inner three who he was very vulnerable with, who were with him in the most pivotal moments of his life. He had 12 dear friends who they went all over the country. They shared meals, and they shared walks, and they shared life. He had this 72 who he knew well enough, and they knew him well enough that they could represent him out kind of in this ministry. And then they had these crowds who considered themselves part of the Jesus movement, who traveled along with Jesus. There are these different levels of belonging, different levels of relationship. They weren't all exactly the same. And this was good, and this was okay. Jesus, when we, as followers of Jesus, when we look at the stories of Jesus, we come to Jesus as the only one who has lived a true human life the way it has been meant to be lived. He's the prototype of what humanity is meant to be. And so there's something here about the way we're relationally meant to work that I think is good for us to listen to. It's interesting that what we see in the life of Jesus has been popping up as like sociologists and psychologists kind of study how human community works. One of the most interesting books I've read on community and belonging is a book called The Search to Belong by a guy, Joseph Myers. It's actually kind of old now, maybe 20 years old. But Myers, he talks about that how human belonging works. And Myers breaks human belonging down into four levels, 4 categories of belonging: intimate, personal, social, and public. That people experience belonging in different ways. They're not all the same. We need them in different amounts. He says intimate belonging is that kind of those relationships in our life, probably just a few of them. We don't have capacity for a lot, but those few relationships in our life where we are like totally 100% vulnerable. We are emotionally naked. best friend, a spouse, like these intimate places of belonging. And then there's personal belonging. He says personal belonging, we have more capacity for this. This is dear friends. This is I'll call you in the middle of the night and when I'm in crisis kind of friendships. So Jesus had his 3, but then Jesus also had his 12, personal belonging. We're meant to experience personal belonging. Then there's this level of social belonging that Myers talks about. Social belonging is the kind of belonging where we exchange Polaroid snapshots of ourselves. Not literal Polaroid snapshots, but it's these exchanges where places where people know your name. Maybe it's not dear friends, but you're known. It's that small village experience where it's like you know Aunt Judy and her flowers, and you know the grocer, and you have the front porch conversation, these kind of social interactions. Jesus had his 72. And then public, that we're meant to have this kind of public belonging. We're meant to have a tribe. We're meant to feel like we're part of a movement. We're meant to feel like we're part of a people that is going somewhere. And so Myers, he says, when we think about human belonging, not all human belonging is created like there's this richness to how we're meant to experience human community. Myers says that there are these different levels of belonging that we're meant to experience. And I think there's just something deeply true. I see it in the Gospels. I see it in my own life, that we're meant to experience belonging at all these. I believe God wants us to have dear friends that we're, or like a few people where we are totally known by and totally accepted by. I believe we're meant to have circles of dear friends that we can call in the middle of the night. I believe we're meant to have places that we're known by name by lots of others. And I believe we're meant to experience places of like we're part of a movement. We're part of something bigger. And if this is true, we should also expect that sin is able to distort or twist or take away each of these levels. And even that disappearance of these things isn't all felt the same way. And that's why it's so interesting that sometimes we talk about being lonely. Like this whole series is talking about the experience of loneliness. But not all loneliness is created equal. Loneliness is not just this flat, uniform experience that we feel in the same way. Because if we're meant to experience belonging in different ways, my guess is we're also going to experience loneliness in different ways. And then what's fascinating is that shows up. I've mentioned before Vivek Murthy, the U.S. Surgeon General. This idea shows up in Murthy's book called Together. Listen to this. Go to this next quote. Murthy says, researchers have identified 3 dimensions of loneliness to reflect the particular type of relationships that are missing. Intimate or emotional loneliness is the longing for a close confidant or intimate partner, someone with whom you share a deep mutual bond of affection and trust. Pause there. That's that intimate level that Myers was talking about. That's that inner 3 that Jesus experienced. We have this longing for a few people who deeply know us. Press play. Relational or social loneliness is the yearning for quality friendships and social companionship and support. Pause there. That's that personal level. We're wired to have dear friends. Jesus is 12, like people that we can call in the middle of the night in the crisis. That's another type of loneliness that we have. And then thirdly, collective loneliness. Collective loneliness is the hunger for a network or community of people who share your sense of purpose and interests. I think in some ways that's kind of combining the social and public that Myers gave us. But we're meant to feel like we're part of a village or a tribe or a movement. And that can be missing as well. And so I just think, I find this resonates in my own life. And the lives that I see around me. You know, I think about times, I can remember in college, there being some seasons where I had dear friends around me. I felt like I was part of, I was on the soccer team and part of my dorm, and I felt like I had a bigger movement. But I can remember times where the person that I thought was meant to be my best friend, my roommate, and we were doing all this stuff together, wasn't really talking to me. And this deep sense of loneliness, like this intimate loneliness, this place where I was connected, I had friends, I was part of something, and yet I was missing this intimate level. Like I thought we had this level of relationship, but this intimate loneliness. That's one kind of loneliness we experience. Or sometimes we experience this personal, this relational level of loneliness, the 12 level of loneliness. Sometimes we might have that that best friend or that spouse, and we feel connected there, but this wider circle of friends, like 12 good friends, we don't have that. I've heard it said one of the greatest miracles of the gospel is a man in his early 30s having 12 good friends. Like in our world today, like like these places, like, you know, that might be the place of loneliness. That's another way we can experience loneliness. Or maybe we experience loneliness at this collective, the social or public level of loneliness. When you look at kind of markers, like when you look at the research and who is more likely to feel lonely, oftentimes it says minorities, immigrants, exchange students are more likely to feel lonely in a given place and time. And it's very possible that they're experiencing this collective loneliness. I don't feel like I'm part of this wider people here. There's different types of loneliness. Not all belonging is created equal. Not all loneliness is created equal. And I think as followers of Jesus, if we're made for a relationship, if the church is to be a place that is good at cultivating and growing community and belonging, I think it's important for us to be deep thinkers, savvy relational gardeners. As we do this life together, I think Jesus has made us. I think he's made every one of us to have a few people who we are totally known and totally accepted by. I think God wants every one of us to have a circle of dear friends who we know we could call 24 hours a day and they would show up for us. I think Jesus wants us to feel like we're part of a village, to have lots of places where we are known by name and we know others by name. I think Jesus wants us to feel part of a movement of people God is doing something in the world through. We're part of something bigger. And when we talk about what is the kind of community, what is the kind of belonging that God is trying to foster, I think it's going to impact all of these different levels. So what do we do with this? What does that mean for us? Well, I mean, just at a basic level, I mean, this whole series, one of the things I think that's been coming up is that just this recognition that we live in this moment, this cultural moment of isolation, of loneliness, of individualism. And so part of being part of the Jesus movement is to be people who pursue intentional community in an age of isolation and individualism. So it's just kind of like following Jesus 101, like that we're to be people who pursue intentional community. We're not, if we live in a cultural moment where everything is drifting towards isolation, then to walk after Jesus is going to be, hey, I choose intentional community. And what's more, I think just some of the insights that we talked about today, I choose intentional community, and that's going to show up at different levels in different ways. It's not all going to look the same. But to be part of Jesus' people is to choose intentional community. Hillcrest, our church family, there is rich community here. And we have room to grow. These are both true. We did this back in the fall. We did this church health survey. We haven't had a chance to talk a lot about the results. We'll probably kind of throughout the year, I'll mention different things that came out of that. 264 people answered it, and a number of metrics like prayer and Bible reading and worship and personal finances and mental health and physical health and relationships, all these different areas. But it's been interesting as we've kind of dug into the results that the area that got lower numbers, kind of lower scores relative to the others, tended to be relationships and community. It wasn't like zeros or anything like that, but kind of relative to the other things, it tended to be. So these are some of the questions that tend to get lower numbers. Are you content with your friendships and relationships? Are your relationships satisfying? Does this church help you foster relationships of accountability? Does the church provide a place you feel connected? Those tended to be a little lower than the other areas that people reported about. And like, we have rich community here. And for some of us, you might be thinking, wow, that's surprising. I feel really connected here. I feel really known here. I feel like I've got great friends here. And I think it's just good to hear that, to be like, oh, maybe everyone isn't having that same experience. It's good to be aware of. And if Jesus is making a people, and if being part of this people is kind of being part of like helping live into the kind of human life God always designed us for, I think it's just, okay, this is something, yes, we have a wonderful community here, and there's ways that we can continue to live into intentional community together. So that leads me to, what would it look like for us to cultivate this kind of community at every level of Hillcrest? What would it look like to lean into that? Because, the irony, this idea of these different spheres, that the kind of the irony would be to take that information and then plop it into a individualistic, consumeristic lens and be like, well, now I'm going to boutique myself, my own little sense of belonging. And no, what does it look like for us together to foster, to cultivate, to create more and more a church with this kind of rich belonging at all these different levels? I think about public belonging, about the ways that we, that biggest level, like we're meant to feel like we're part of a movement. And I think corporate worship, singing together, being physically present is one way that we do that. We cultivate and we make space for others to experience public belonging. There is something that happens in your soul when you're in a room with hundreds of other people singing "How Great Is Our God" that doesn't happen when you're on your own. And so I just think the practice of corporate gathering, you're here, great job. You're already on the right track. But I think it's a good practice. It's healthy. And I love that we have online church. I love that if you're sick, if you're stuck at home, if you're injured, if you're traveling, that you can join us via the wonders of technology. But I worry about falling into patterns of PJs and a cup of coffee and not seeing people in person. We're meant to experience public belonging, and we're meant to show up and offer that experience to others. We do this together. Public belonging. Social level belonging. What does it look like to cultivate social level belonging? This is one of those levels that is really drying up. A couple of weeks ago when I talked about sin in our society, that kind of small town conversation, that front porch, exchanging Polaroid snapshots, just knowing people by name. That's one of those levels of belonging that's really drying up in our society today. And it's also, social level belonging is one of the levels that can be devalued in Christian communities. Because if it's not vulnerable enough or serious enough or spiritual enough, maybe it's not worth doing. But this is part of how we're meant to belong at a social level. I am glad we have ultimate frisbee on Sunday afternoons and watercolor classes and walking groups. We are wired to have these kind of spaces that we can just be known by name. It's good. It's part of human belonging. And so if you have ideas about whatever, ski trips or dance get-togethers, or bring those. We want to make space for that kind of social level belonging. I love it when after service people hang out and just say hi and learn a name. That's good. I hope that Hillcrest more and more doesn't feel like, and I don't think it does feel like this way. When I think about the years and years to come, I want it to feel like walking into a small village where lots of people know your name. And maybe you don't know everything about them, but you know, you're greeted. You're missed if you're not here. It should be more like that than going to a movie. Just anonymous strangers shuffling in and then shuffling out. Right? And so, choose the spiritual discipline of staying 15 minutes after service. If you want, we're even talking about trying to get together some individuals, for each section, for each service, just to make sure that everybody gets greeted by name. If you're interested in being part of that, put it on a community card. I'd be interested in being one of the name greeters on Sunday mornings. We'd love to do that. I hope that, my desire that if somebody comes to Hillcrest, that they would have the experience of another human being looking them in the eye and saying, "Hi, my name's Tim. What's yours? That is a good experience in a world missing social belonging. Public belonging, social belonging, personal belonging. These dear friends, like, my goodness, I hope you have friends who you're following Jesus with, who you know they would call you past midnight if they were in trouble. Like, we need this in our lives. Small groups are a place that we try to help foster this. But let's be honest, joining a small group doesn't start at that. Joining a small group starts at the social level. That's just the reality of, like, this is how dynamics work. But hopefully they can grow into that personal level, with this kind of level of trust and knowing. Deep spiritual transformation happens at this level. Yeah. And we want to continue to foster those spaces. And then, of course, intimate belonging. And this is the hardest to help foster. But just to encourage, like, we need places where we are totally 100% vulnerable. Accountability partners, best friends, spouses. And we can choose if we're going to be vulnerable in that way or not. Like, we need places like that. But when I think about being a place that chooses intentional community, we should be savvy relational community cultivators. We should be savvy relational doctors. Oh, you're feeling lonely. Tell me more about where are you feeling lonely and where are you not feeling lonely? Like, if God has made us for relationship, I want us to be wise people in how we cultivate and make space for relationship at all the different levels we're meant to be experiencing it. May we be about intentional community in an age of individualistic consumerism and isolation. I'll just end with this last thought. Because if I just end there, the danger is, and Carlo, there you are. You, the worship team, can start coming up here, just as I say this last thing. The danger is that we leave with the message, like, we can grow community. All right, go try really hard. If we don't get there, it's our own fault. Like, that's never the message of the gospel. The message of the gospel is always God is doing something in and through us. We're invited to cooperate, and His grace is going to make up the difference. And so I just want to remind us, like, this is what Jesus is building. This is what Jesus put on display. This is the people that He is making, this kind of rich type of community. And Jesus knows it's messy and hard. Jesus knows what it is like to be disappointed and hurt at every one of these levels. And He has entered into that hurt on our behalf. Jesus knows what it's like to have His inner three when He says, I need you, be with me, and they are falling asleep. And one of His inner three, Peter, when Jesus is arrested, Peter says, I don't even know that guy. Jesus knows what it's like to have one of His dearest friends be the one to stab Him in the back and the rest run away. Jesus knows that the 72 were nowhere to be seen when He went to the cross, and Jesus knows that it was the crowds who were chanting, crucify Him. Like, Jesus knows the hurt of every one of these levels. And Jesus came to carry that, to offer forgiveness for us. When we fall short, we're let down by others. He is the one who gives us the vision. It's by His Spirit that He is making a new thing, and it is His grace that makes up the difference. And so, just church, as we live into this, may we look to Him for our strength, for our vision, and for our grace. Let's pray. Lord, in this world that we live in, the moment we live in, we just ask for Your strength, Your vision, Your inspiration to walk differently, to see people differently, to look into eyes, to ask deep questions, to have courage, to be vulnerable, to apologize. Lord, I just ask for Your Spirit in our own individual lives, in our families, in our homes, in our small groups, in our whole church. Would you grow the kind of rich community You made us for? pray this in your good name. Amen.
Thanks for listening. For more info, visit hcbellingham.com and join us any Sunday, 9 and 11 a.m.